Settle in close to the fire tonight. The night is long and the road is cold, and I have a story for you that I have not told in many years. This is a story I lived myself, friend, in the early years when the road was still new to me. It is a story about a winter I spent at a small farm in the high upland country, and about a sound I heard there on certain nights, and about a small family who knew what the sound was and how to wait for it to pass. It is a story I have carried with me for most of my life, and that I will tell you now slowly, because some stories are not meant to be hurried, and this is one of them. Pour yourself something warm. Let the fire find its own quiet rhythm, and listen. The year was the 4th winter after I had left my grandmother's cottage in the lower country and taken to the road with my pack and my staff and the small bone whistle she had given me. I was 25. I had been singing for my supper at the doors of farmhouses and the hearths of small village inns for nearly 4 years by then, and I had begun, in the slow, patient way of a young man learning his trade, to be a little better at it than I had been at the start. The autumn of that year had gone late and cold. I had been walking the western roads of the old country since the early summer, and by the end of October, I had begun to think seriously about where I would shelter for the winter. The lower country was, in those years, a country that received traveling singers gladly enough through the warm seasons, but that grew careful and frugal in the cold months. A wandering bard with no land and no kin was not, in November, the most welcome guest at a small farmer's hearth. The farmers had their own small winter mouths to feed. I had decided, in the slow, patient way of a young man considering a hard decision, that I would walk up into the high country before the snow closed the upper passes, and that I would try to find, in some small remote upland farm, a winter's shelter in exchange for whatever small work my hands and my songs could offer. I had been told, by an older drover I had walked with for 2 days in the lower country, of a small upland farm at the head of a long, quiet glen called Glen Allach. The drover had said the family there were honest people. The drover had said they sometimes took in a traveller for the winter if the traveller was willing to do the work of an extra hand at the farm. The drover had warned me, in the slow, careful way of an older man warning a younger one, that the farm was a strange place. He had not, when I asked him in what particular way it was strange, given me any further detail. He had said only that I should go and see for myself. I had walked up into Glen Allach in the 2nd week of November. The glen was, friend, one of the longest and quietest glens I had walked into in my 4 years on the road. It ran north and west into the upper passes for perhaps 8 miles. The lower part of the glen had a small village of 7 cottages and a kirk. The middle part had 2 scattered small farms, with the smoke of their chimneys visible against the pale autumn sky. The upper part, where the road climbed toward the small farm I was seeking, had nothing but heather and stone and the occasional sheep. The road in the upper part was very narrow. It was, by the look of it, walked perhaps 3 or 4 times a week by the people of the upper farm, and not at all by anyone else. I came up to the farm in the late afternoon, in the slow, falling cold light of a clear November day. The farm was small. It sat in a small flat hollow at the head of the glen, with the upper slopes rising steeply on 3 sides, and the open glen falling away to the south. There was a single low farmhouse of grey moor stone, with a roof of dark turf, and a single thin column of pale wood smoke rising from a small stone chimney at the centre. There was a small stone byre at the back, where 2 slow brown cows were watching me come up the path with the careful attention of cows that did not see strangers very often. There was a small enclosure of stacked stones to the east, with perhaps 40 grey sheep at the lower end. There was a small wooden chicken shed beside the farmhouse, and a small wood pile, and a small low stone shelter at the side of the yard, where the family kept their small store of winter peat. There was nothing else. The nearest other dwelling, the drover had told me, was 2 hours' walk back down the glen. The kirk and the small village at the bottom of the glen were a half-day's walk in good weather. The small farm at the head of Glen Allach was, in the slow, honest way of upland farms in the old country, a small island of human life in a large, quiet country. I knocked at the heavy wooden door of the farmhouse. It was opened, after a small pause, by a man of perhaps 55 years. He was small and grey and weathered, in the way that upland farmers grow small and grey and weathered in their later years. He wore a dark wool tunic and dark wool breeches and a worn leather jerkin. His grey beard was cut close to the jaw. His hands at the door, when he held the door open, were the slow, careful hands of a man who had done the small, honest work of a small farm for 40 years. He looked at me. He did not, friend, immediately speak. I told him my name. I told him that I was a travelling singer from the lower country. I told him that I had been told, by the drover I had met on the road, that he sometimes took in a traveller for the winter in exchange for the work of an extra hand. I told him that I would be grateful, in the deepest way that a young man with no kin and no fire of his own can be grateful, for a small place at his hearth for the cold months. He listened without interrupting. He nodded once when I had finished. He said, in the soft, slow accent of the upper passes, "What can you do, lad?" I told him. I told him that I could chop wood in the slow, patient way I had been taught at my grandmother's cottage in the lower country. I told him that I could carry water from a winter spring, that I could mend a leather harness, that I could clean out a byre, that I could split kindling, that I could feed chickens and watch sheep. I told him that I could play the small bone whistle of an evening, if the family wished it, and that I could sing the slow old songs of the country if the family wished that. I told him, in the slow, careful way of a young man making his case, that I would do whatever small work he asked me to do for the duration of the winter, and that I would do it without complaint, in exchange for a small place at his fire, and a small share of his food, and a small bed somewhere out of the cold. He listened. He said at the end, "Lad, come in." The farmhouse was small and dim and warm. The main room ran the full length of the building. A low fire burned in a stone hearth at the center of the long wall to the right. A heavy oak table stood at the center of the room with 2 long wooden benches alongside it. A small wooden cupboard stood at the back wall. A small wooden ladder led up to a small loft above the back of the room. A smaller back door led, by the look of it, to the byre and the backyard. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. The walls were dark with the smoke of many years. The family were gathered when I came in around the table. There was the older farmer who had opened the door, whose name was Ewan. There was his wife, a small grey woman of perhaps the same age, named Mary. There was their grown son, a man of perhaps 30 years, named Donald. There was Donald's wife, a young woman of perhaps 27, named Kate. There was an old grandmother, the older farmer's mother by the look of her, who must have been close to 80, whose name was Bridie. They were sitting at the table with bowls of barley broth in front of them, and a small loaf of dark bread, and a small clay jug of milk. They had been, by the look of it, just sitting down to their evening meal when I had knocked. They looked up at me when Ewan brought me in. They did not, friend, look surprised. They looked at me with the slow, steady attention of upland farmers who had seen a winter traveller arrive at their door perhaps once a year for as many winters as they could remember, and who knew by long, quiet experience what arriving for the winter looked like. They did not seem alarmed. They did not seem displeased. They did not seem, in any visible way, particularly welcoming either. They simply registered me, in the quiet, patient way of people who lived alone at the head of a long, quiet glen, and who were used to whatever the road brought up to them. Ewan introduced me. He said my name. He said where I had come from. He said that I had asked for shelter for the winter in exchange for the work of an extra hand. He said that I had given my list of what I could do. He said, finally, that he was minded to take me in for the winter, and that he had brought me into the house so that the family could see me and ask me whatever questions they wished to ask. The family asked me, friend, very few questions. Mary asked me whether I had any sickness. I said that I did not. Kate asked me whether I had a wife or kin who would expect to know where I had wintered. I said that I had only my grandmother in the lower country, that I wrote her in the spring, and that she was content to know that I was alive and well. Donald asked me whether I had been in any trouble with the law. I said that I had not. Bridie, the old grandmother at the foot of the table, did not ask me anything. She looked at me for some time with her old pale eyes set deep in her old lined face, and she did not, in any way I could read, give me any sign of what she was thinking. When the questions were done, Ewan said, "Lad, sit at the table, eat." I sat, I ate. The barley broth was hot and good. The bread was the dense, dark bread of the high country. The milk was the slow, rich milk of the small, slow, brown cows in the byre. I ate, friend, in the slow, careful way of a young man who had been on a cold road since first light, and who was, in some small private way, tasting for the first time in many weeks the food of a settled hearth. When the meal was over, Ewan rose. He said that I would sleep that night in the small loft above the back of the main room. He said that there was a small bed there, with a wool blanket and a small pillow stuffed with heather, that had been used by other winter travelers in earlier years, and that was kept in the slow, patient way of upland farms, for whatever winter mouth came up the glen in any given year. He said that breakfast was at first light, and that the work of the day began as soon as breakfast was done. He said one more thing, friend, before he sent me up the ladder to the loft. He said, "Lad, there are a few things about this farm that you will need to know. I will tell you most of them in the morning, in the slow, steady way that small things at a small farm are taught. But there is one thing I will tell you tonight, before you sleep, because it could come up at any time, and I do not want you, if it comes up tonight, to be unprepared." I said that I was listening. He said, "Lad, there are some nights at this farm, in the deep winter, when we hear a sound on the roof. The sound is the sound of something walking, not feet, not paws, something else. The sound is slow and heavy and steady, and it walks across the turf above us, in some pattern that the grandmother knows the shape of, and that the rest of us have learned in our generations. The sound has been part of this farm for as long as the family has held this farm. It is not a thing we welcome. It is not a thing we fear. It is a thing we wait through, in the slow, careful way of a family that has been wading through it for many generations." He paused. He looked at me. He said, "Lad, if the sound comes tonight, or any night, you will hear it. The roof of this house is thin. The sound is very clear from inside. If it comes, you will know what it is. And the rule of this farm, when the sound comes, is that you do nothing. You do not go outside. You do not look out the window. You do not climb up the ladder to look at the underside of the turf. You sit where you are. You stay quiet. You wait. You let the family do the small things we do, and you do not interfere with them, and you do not ask any questions about them. The sound will pass. It always passes. By the deep middle of the night, the sound is gone, and the morning comes as it always comes." I said that I understood. He said, "Lad, the grandmother has, in her own private way, certain small things she does when the sound comes. Her things are the family's things. They are not the things of a guest. You will not, on those nights, do any of her things. You will not speak any words she speaks. You will not, friend, even attempt to learn the words she speaks, because the words are her words and the family's words, and they belong to this hearth and this hearth only. Do you understand me, lad?" I said that I did. He said, "Good. Then sleep well tonight. The sound may come tonight. It may not. The sound comes when it comes. If it comes, you know what to do." He gestured to the small wooden ladder at the back of the room. I climbed up to the small loft. I lay, friend, in the small narrow bed in the small loft above the back of the main room of the farmhouse at the head of Glen Allach in the cold November dark, and I did not, for some time, sleep. I lay in the small, dim warmth of the loft, with the slow, soft sounds of the family settling for the night below me, and I thought about what Ewan had told me. I thought about a sound that walked on the roof of a small upland farmhouse on certain winter nights. I thought about a family that had been wading through that sound for many generations. I thought about an old grandmother who knew certain small things to do when the sound came, and certain small words to speak, and a rule that the words and the things belonged only to her hearth. I thought, friend, about my own grandmother in the lower country, who had taught me certain old rules of her own. I thought that there were, in the old country in those years, more such hearths than the lower people of the lower country knew of, and more such rules, and more such old grandmothers who held the careful knowledge of how to wait through certain things. I thought, finally, that I had come to the right farm for the winter. I went at last to sleep. Let me pause a moment. Friend, the story is beginning. Are you settled? Pull your blanket closer if you are cold. The fire is good for some hours yet. I will go on. The sound did not come on the first night. It did not come on the second night either. It did not come on the third or the fourth or the fifth. I settled in those first weeks into the slow, steady work of a small upland farm in the early winter. I rose at first light. I broke the ice on the water trough at the byre. I fed the chickens. I helped Donald drive the sheep down from the upper field to the lower fold for the night. I split kindling for the fire. I cleaned out the byre. I carried peat from the small stone shelter to the hearth. I mended what needed mending and watched what needed watching, and I did, in the slow, patient way I had told you and I would do, whatever small work the family asked me to do. In the evenings, after the meal, I played the small bone whistle by the fire. I played, in the slow old way my grandmother had taught me, the old tunes of the lower country. The family liked them. Bridie, the old grandmother, liked them most of all. She would sit on her low stool by the hearth in the slow, steady way of an old woman warming her thin hands, and she would close her eyes, and she would let the old tunes settle into her in the way that old tunes settle into old people who have known the same tunes since their own childhoods. I asked her once, on a quiet evening early in December, whether she had known any of these tunes from her own younger years. She looked at me for a long moment with her old pale eyes, and she said, in the soft, slow voice of a very old woman, "Lad, I have known some of them, not all. The ones I have known were taught to me by my own grandmother in this same room 67 years ago. She had been taught them by her own grandmother in this same room 60 years before that. The tunes are older than the farm, lad. The farm is 240 years old. The tunes are older." I asked her, very gently, whether the family had been at the farm for all 240 years. She said, "Lad, the family has been at this farm since the year of our Lord, 1647. The farm was built by my husband's great-great-grandfather in that year. He came up into this glen with his young wife and his small son and one cow, and he built this house with his own hands in a single summer, and he made the slow life of this farm out of the heather and the stone. There has been no other family in this farmhouse, lad, in all the generations since. It is the same family. It is the same hearth." I asked her, even more gently, whether the sound on the roof had been at the farm for all 240 years. She did not, friend, answer me at once. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, finally, in a voice that was perhaps a little quieter than the voice she had been using, "Lad, the sound was at this hollow before the farm was at this hollow. My husband's great-great-grandfather found it here when he built the house. He had not, lad, when he chose this hollow for the building, known that the sound was here. He learned it in his first winter. He did not, after he had learned it, go away. He stayed. He had his own reasons for staying that I will not, lad, in any conversation about it, attempt to explain to you, but he stayed, and his son stayed, and his son's son stayed, and we have been here ever since, and the sound has been here with us. The sound is older than us. The sound is older, lad, than the family knows." She closed her eyes. She did not, after that, say more about it. I did not, after that, ask. Let me stop here, traveler, just for a breath. The next part of the story is the longer part, and I do not want you to lose the thread. Are you warm enough? The fire is good. We are in no hurry. The first night the sound came was a Tuesday in the 3rd week of January. There had been a hard fall of snow earlier in the day. The country around the farm was, by the late afternoon, deep in fresh white snow. The sky had cleared after the snow, and by the early evening the moon was rising over the upper slopes, full and very bright, with the kind of cold, pale light that turns deep snow into a country of silver. We had eaten our evening meal at the usual time. We had sat by the fire afterward in the usual quiet way. Donald had been mending a piece of leather harness. Kate had been knitting. Ewan had been at the wooden table with a small piece of paper in front of him, working at some small, careful calculation of the year's accounts. Mary had been at the small wooden cupboard at the back wall, putting away the clean wooden bowls from the meal. Bridie had been on her low stool by the hearth. I had been on the bench across from Donald, the small bone whistle in my hand, playing very softly, the way I had been playing for the family in the slow, quiet evenings of the past 2 months. The sound began, friend, at perhaps the 4th hour after dark. I heard it first. I was the youngest pair of ears in the room. I had been playing a slow old tune of my grandmother's, a tune called The Long Walk. In the slow, patient way the tune was meant to be played, and in the small pause between 2 of its slow phrases I had heard, very faintly, from the turf roof above the main room, a single soft, heavy step. I stopped playing. The room did not, in that moment, immediately register the change. Donald continued his work on the harness. Kate continued her knitting. Ewan continued at the table. Mary continued at the cupboard. Bridie, on a low stool by the hearth, was the first of the family to react. She lifted her old grey head very slightly. She turned her old pale eyes toward the dark turf above us. Then the second step came. It was, friend, exactly what Ewan had told me on my first night at the farm. It was not feet. It was not paws. It was the slow, heavy, steady sound of something else, walking on the turf roof of the farmhouse. The step was deliberate. The step was patient. The step was, in some quality I cannot fully name, the step of something that had been walking in places much harder to walk in than the turf roof of a small farmhouse. And that was walking on the turf roof, now in the same slow, steady way it had been walking in its own old country for as long as it had walked anywhere. The third step came. The family moved. I will tell you, friend, what they did. I will tell you because I watched them in the slow, long minutes of that first night, from my place on the bench across from Donald, with the small bone whistle still in my hand and my breath very quiet in my chest. Mary closed the wooden cupboard at the back wall. She closed it without making any sound. She walked, in the slow, even steps of a woman who had done this many times before, to the heavy wooden front door of the farmhouse. She drew the heavy iron bar across it. She did not, in this drawing, make any sound either. She turned. She walked, in the same slow, even steps, to the small back door that led to the byre and the backyard. She drew the heavy iron bar across that door also. She turned. She walked back to her place at the cupboard. She stood, with her hands clasped quietly in front of her apron, and she waited. Donald set down the leather harness. He set it down without making any sound. He rose from the bench across from me. He walked, in the slow, even steps of a man who had also done this many times before, to the heavy wooden bench by the small back door. He sat down on the bench with his back to the door. He folded his hands in his lap. He did not, friend, look up at the turf roof. He did not look at any of us. He looked, in the slow, steady way of a man holding a particular post, at the hearth in the center of the long wall. Kate set down her knitting. She rose from her stool. She walked, in even steps, to the small wooden cupboard where Mary had been. She opened a small, low drawer at the bottom of the cupboard. She took out, from the drawer, 4 small white wax candles. She brought them to the wooden table. She set them at the 4 corners of the table. She lit them, one by one, from the embers of the hearth. The candles burned with a slow, steady flame in the otherwise dim room. Ewan rose from his place at the table. He went to the hearth. He took up the iron poker. He did not, friend, stoke the fire. He banked it. He banked it deliberately, in the slow, careful way of a man building up the heat of a fire to last a long time, in the way that a man banks a fire that he intends to keep burning steadily through a long, careful watch. He placed 3 new pieces of peat on the banked coals. He set the poker down. He returned to his place at the table. He sat. He folded his hands. He waited. Bridie, last of all, did the thing that was hers. She rose from her low stool by the hearth. She walked in the slow, careful steps of a very old woman to the wooden cupboard at the back wall. She reached up to a high shelf above the cupboard, where in all the 2 months I had been at the farm I had not seen anyone reach. She took down, from the shelf, a small clay jar. The jar was old. It was small. It was the color of the dark moor stone of the cottage walls. It had no markings on it, friend, that I could see from across the room. She brought the jar to the wooden table. She set it at the center of the table, in the small space between the 4 white candles. She did not, friend, open it. Then she turned in the same slow, careful steps, and she went to her own small, low stool by the hearth, and she sat down on it. She folded her old thin hands in her lap. She closed her eyes. She waited. The whole family, friend, was now in their positions, Mary at the front of the room, having barred both doors. Donald at the back, with his back to the door, watching the hearth. Kate standing beside the table with the 4 lit candles. Ewan at the table with the small clay jar at its center. Bridie at the hearth, eyes closed, hands folded, in some slow, private state of attention I did not yet understand. I, friend, was on the bench across from where Donald had been. I did not, in those first slow, long minutes of my watching, know what I should do. I had been told by Ewan that on these nights I was to do nothing. I was to sit where I was. I was to stay quiet. I was to let the family do the small things they did. I was not to interfere. I was not to speak any words. I was not, in particular, to speak any of the words the grandmother might speak. I sat on the bench. I held the small bone whistle in my lap. I made my breath as quiet as I could make it. Above us, on the turf roof, the slow, heavy, steady walking continued. Forgive me, friend. The story is at its long, quiet middle now, and the long, quiet middle is the hardest part to tell. Pull your blanket up. The fire is good. I will tell it slowly. The walking went on, friend, for perhaps 2 hours. It moved across the turf roof in a particular slow pattern. It walked, in the first hour, along the long axis of the roof, from the eastern eaves toward the western eaves, in even steps. Then it stopped. There was a pause of perhaps a quarter of an hour, in which the only sounds in the room were the slow, soft crackling of the banked peat fire on the hearth, the slow, soft burning of the 4 white candles on the table, and the slow, soft breathing of the 5 members of the family in their 5 careful positions. Then the walking began again. It walked, in the second hour, across the short axis of the roof. It went, in even steps, from the northern eaves to the southern eaves, then back again. It did this perhaps 6 times. Each crossing took, by my reckoning, about 3 minutes. Each crossing went directly above the wooden table where Ewan was sitting, and where the small clay jar stood at the center between the 4 white candles. The thing on the roof, friend, was searching. I understood this in the slow, long minutes of my watching, in the slow, private way of a young man understanding a difficult thing without being told. The thing on the turf roof was not, in any random sense, walking back and forth above us. It was walking back and forth in a slow, patient pattern that was, in its own terms, a search. It was looking for something. It was looking for a particular small thing at a particular small place on the roof or in the building below the roof. It was, in its slow, careful way, taking its time, in the way that something patient and old takes its time when it has come for a thing it has been coming for in some pattern of returning, For as long as it has been coming, I understood, in the same slow minute of my understanding, what the small clay jar at the center of the table was for. The jar was, in some way I did not yet have the words for, the careful answer to the things searching. It was an answer placed in a particular place, in a particular careful way, on a particular careful night, in a particular family's particular hearth, by a particular old woman who had been taught the placing by her own grandmother 67 years earlier in this same room. The jar was the family's part of an old slow agreement. The thing on the roof was the other party to the agreement. The walking was the thing on the roof confirming, in its own slow, patient way, that the agreement was being kept. In the late part of the second hour, friend, the walking changed. It stopped, in mid-pattern, somewhere above the center of the room. It stayed still for perhaps a full minute. Then it moved very slowly toward the small stone chimney that came up through the turf roof above the hearth. It approached the chimney in careful steps. It stopped at the base of the chimney. There was a long pause. I heard, friend, in the long, careful seconds of that pause, a soft sound that I will tell you about now, even though I have not, in the years since, ever told anyone. The sound was the sound of something putting its mouth, or whatever it had in place of a mouth, against the open top of the small stone chimney. The sound was very soft. It was not a sound that a person would have heard from outside the cottage. It was a sound that we heard, inside the cottage, only because the chimney came down through the room and ended at the hearth, and because the sound was, in some quiet way, falling down the chimney into the room with us. The sound was the soft sound of something breathing into the chimney. It was a slow, patient breathing. It was not the breathing of a creature drawing in air to live. It was a different kind of breathing. It was the slow, careful exhalation of something blowing, very gently, down the small stone column of the chimney, in the slow, patient way of something testing, in some old, long-practiced way, whether the air in the chimney was still the air of a hearth that was occupied by the family it had come for. I did not, friend, in the long, careful seconds of that breathing, look at the hearth. I looked at Bridie. Bridie was on her low stool by the hearth with her old eyes still closed and her old thin hands still folded in her lap. She did not, friend, in any visible way, react to the breathing at the chimney. She did not flinch. She did not stiffen. She did not open her eyes. She was, in some slow, private way I did not understand, simply present in her old, folded, patient way at the place she had taken at the hearth. She opened her mouth. She spoke, in a soft, small voice, a single word. I will not, friend, repeat the word she spoke. I will tell you only that the word was a single word, in some old language I did not know, that was perhaps 2 syllables long, and that was spoken in the small soft voice of a very old woman into the warm dim air of the room in the direction of the small stone chimney above the hearth. The breathing at the chimney stopped. There was a small pause. A long, quiet second, the kind of second in which something old and patient on the other side of a thin barrier registers, in its own slow private understanding, that what it has been told to register has been said correctly, and that the agreement has been kept for another year. Then the walking on the roof resumed. It moved in even steps away from the chimney. It walked across the turf to the western eaves. It paused at the western eaves for perhaps 3 slow seconds. Then it stepped, in a single slow, soft sound, off the eaves into the deep snow of the night yard. It walked away across the upper field. I heard the slow, soft sound of its steps in the deep snow growing fainter for perhaps half a minute. Then the sound was gone. The room was, for some time after that, perfectly quiet. The 4 white candles continued to burn at the 4 corners of the wooden table. The small clay jar continued to stand at the center of the table between them. The fire continued to burn in its slow, patient, banked way on the hearth. The 5 members of the family continued to hold their 5 careful positions. After perhaps 10 minutes, Bridie opened her eyes. She looked at Ewan. Ewan looked back at her. He nodded once, in the slow, steady way of a man confirming that the night had gone as such nights were meant to go. Bridie nodded back. She rose very slowly from her low stool. She walked, in the careful steps of a very old woman, to the wooden table. She took up the small clay jar from the center of the table. She carried it, in both old thin hands, to the wooden cupboard at the back wall. She reached up to the high shelf where she had taken it down from. She placed the small clay jar back on the high shelf in exactly the position it had been in before. The other members of the family, in their own quiet times, came out of their positions. Kate came to the table and blew out, one by one, the 4 white candles. She gathered them in her hands. She returned them to the small low drawer of the cupboard from which she had taken them. She closed the drawer. Donald rose from the bench by the back door. He stretched his back, in the small steady way of a man who had been sitting still in one position for a long time. He returned to the bench across from where I was sitting. He picked up the leather harness. He examined it, in the small quiet way of a man checking that he had not, in his absence from his work, lost any of the small careful pins he had been using. The pins were all there. He set the harness down for the night. Mary went to the heavy wooden front door. She drew back the iron bar. She did not open the door. She returned in the same slow, even steps to the heavy wooden back door. She drew back its iron bar also. She returned to her place at the cupboard. She did not, in that returning, look at any of us. Ewan rose from the table. He went to the hearth. He stoked the fire, in the small, ordinary way of a man preparing to bank a fire for the night. The night, friend, after that, was a normal winter night. The family sat for some time longer at the table and at the hearth. Donald asked me quietly whether I was all right. I said that I was. Kate asked me whether I had any questions. I said that I did not, in that moment, have any questions that I felt right asking. She nodded. She said that this was wise. She said that the family did not, in the days after the sound, often speak of it directly. She said that I would, as the winter went on, develop my own sense of what I could and could not ask, and of what the family was and was not willing to speak of, and that the rule of the farm was that no one would push me to ask things I was not ready to ask, and that no one would push me to keep silent about things that were not, in the family's own private accounting, things that needed to be kept silent about. I said that I understood. I went eventually up the small wooden ladder to the small loft above the back of the room. I lay in the small narrow bed under the small wool blanket. I did not, friend, sleep until the deepest part of the night. I lay in the loft, with the slow, soft sounds of the family settling for the night below me, and I thought about what I had heard. I thought about a thing that walked on the turf roof of an upland farmhouse on certain winter nights. I thought about a small clay jar on a high shelf that was an answer to the thing searching. I thought about an old grandmother who knew a single old word in some old language that confirmed, in some slow, patient way, that the agreement was being kept. I thought, friend, about my own grandmother in the lower country, who had taught me the rule about voices at doors, and I understood, in the slow, long thinking of that night, that there were many such hearths in the old country in those years, and many such families, and many such old women who held the careful knowledge of how to wait through certain things. I went at last to sleep. The walking came, that winter, on 5 more nights. It came in the 2nd week of February. It came on a Sunday in late February. It came on 2 consecutive nights in the 2nd week of March. It came, finally, on a single night in the 3rd week of March, after which the deep winter began to give way to the slow, muddy thaw of the early spring, and the walking did not, after that night, come again that winter. Each of the 6 times the walking came, friend, the family did the same things they had done on the first night. Mary barred both doors. Donald sat with his back to the back door and watched the hearth. Kate set the 4 white candles at the corners of the wooden table. Ewan banked the fire. Bridie took down the small clay jar from the high shelf and placed it at the center of the table. And each time, in the deep middle of the walking, the thing on the roof came to the chimney. And each time, when the thing breathed into the chimney, Bridie spoke a single old word in the soft, small voice of a very old woman. And each time, after the word, the thing on the roof walked away across the upper field, and the night returned, in its own slow, patient way, to a normal winter night. I learned, in those 6 nights, the slow, careful rhythm of the family's waiting. I learned that the walking did not always last the same length of time. The first night had been about 2 hours. The night in February had been less than an hour. The 2 consecutive nights in March had been longer, perhaps 3 hours each. The final night had been the shortest, only about 40 minutes. I asked Kate, quietly, in the days after the longest night, whether the length of the walking meant anything. She said that the family had, in their generations, observed the length, and had not, in their slow, patient observing, ever found a pattern. The length was, she said, the thing's own choice. The family could not predict it. They could only wait. I learned also that the family did not, on the days after the walking, behave any differently than they did on ordinary days. The morning after each visit was, in every visible way, a normal morning. Mary made the porridge. Donald drove the sheep down to the lower fold. Ewan worked at his accounts. Bridie sat by the hearth in the slow, steady way of an old woman warming her thin hands. The visit of the night before was not, in the family's daily life, the central matter of the day. It was a thing that had been done. The family had done their part of the doing. The thing had done its part. The agreement had been kept. The day, in its own slow way, went on. I left the farm in the 2nd week of April. The snow was gone from the lower passes. The roads to the south were open. I had, in my 5 months at the farm, done my small share of the work, and I had been given, in return, the slow gift of a winter at a settled hearth in a country that was, in its own slow, patient way, kind to a young traveller who had no kin and no fire of his own. The family came out, on the morning I left, to see me off at the small stone gate of the farmyard. Ewan shook my hand. He said, in the soft, slow voice of an upland farmer, that I had done good, honest work, and that I was welcome, in any winter to come back to the farm if I needed shelter again. Mary gave me a small loaf of dark bread for the road. Donald gave me a small piece of hard yellow cheese. Kate gave me a small piece of fresh wool for the small leather pouch at my belt. Bridie did not, friend, give me anything in her hands. She gave me instead a slow look from her old pale eyes, and a slow nod of her old grey head, and a single small private smile that she had not, in the 5 months I had been at the farm, given me before. I shouldered my pack. I took up my staff. I walked, in the slow, steady steps of a young traveller setting out at the start of a new season, down the long, slow road of Glen Allach toward the lower country. I did not, friend, in the rest of my long life, ever return to that country. I did not return, not because I had been frightened away from it. I had not been frightened. The family had been kind to me. The winter at the farm had been one of the kindest winters of my long life. I did not return because I understood, in the slow, private way of my understanding, that the small clay jar on the high shelf and the old grandmother's single old word were not for me. They were for the family. They were the family's part of an old slow agreement that had been kept by the family at that hearth for 10 generations. And the agreement was the family's, and the keeping was the family's, and the strangers who came up the glen for a winter were welcome to learn what it looked like to keep such an agreement. But the keeping itself was not a thing a stranger could take with him when he left. I have, friend, in the long years since, walked many other glens in many other countries. I have stayed at many other small farms in many other deep winters. I have heard, in the slow, careful telling of many old farmers and many old grandmothers, of many other old agreements that the old families of the old country have been keeping in their generations, with many other slow old things that walk on the roofs and breathe in the chimneys, and search in the deep nights of the deep winters. I have not, friend, in any of those other countries, stayed at any farm where the agreement was as old as the agreement at the head of Glen Allach. The agreement at Glen Allach was, by my own slow count, 240 years old when I was there. It is, in the years since, more than 300 years old now. It is, by some long, slow telling I have heard from a drover in the lower country 2 summers ago, still being kept by some old grandmother of the same family, at the same hearth, with the same small clay jar on the same high shelf, in the same slow, careful way. The family have, in their generations, kept their part of the agreement. The thing on the roof has, in its own slow, patient way, kept its part. I will tell you, friend, what my own grandmother told me when I was a boy, on the small wooden stool beside her kitchen hearth in the long winters of my childhood, about the old agreements of the old country. She said that the country had been, in its long, slow history, a country of many such agreements. She said that some of the agreements had been kept for as long as the families had remembered. She said that some had been broken in the long generations by particular families on particular nights, by mistake or by pride, or by the particular small foolishness of a particular young man or woman who had thought, in their own moment, that they knew better than 10 generations of their own kin had known. She said that the families that had broken the agreements were not, in the long, slow accounting of the country, families that the country still spoke of. She said the country had, in its slow, patient way, made room for the families that had kept their agreements, and had quietly forgotten, in the same slow, patient way, the families that had not. She said, finally, that the rule of the agreements was the simplest rule of the old country. The rule was, when you have come to a hearth where an agreement has been kept for many generations, you do not interfere with the keeping. You sit on the bench where the family asks you to sit. You hold the small bone whistle in your lap. You make your breath as quiet as you can make it. You let the family do the small things they do. And in the morning, when the morning comes, you thank the family for the shelter, and you go on with your road, and you carry, in the small private place of your own understanding, the slow, careful gift of what you have been allowed to witness. I have, friend, in my long life on the road, tried to keep that rule. I have, in the kindness of many small upland farms in many deep winters, been allowed to witness many old agreements being kept. I have not, friend, ever spoken any of the words the old grandmothers spoke. I have not ever opened any of the small clay jars they took down from their high shelves. I have not ever asked, in any farmhouse in any deep winter, for any further explanation of any old agreement than the family was willing, in their own time, to give me. I have only, in my own slow, patient way, listened to the walking on the roofs. I have only, in my own slow, patient way, watched the families do their small things. I have only, in my own slow, patient way, carried what I have witnessed in the small private place of my own understanding, in the way my grandmother told me to carry it. I will tell you, friend, before we let the fire go down and let the night take us into sleep, the old saying my grandmother taught me at the end of every long winter evening of my boyhood. She said that the saying was not, in any private sense, hers. She said that the saying was the country's. She said that the saying was meant to be passed on, in the slow, careful way of all the old things of the old country, from one generation to the next. The saying went like this: there are slow old things in the old country, friend, and the slow old things have been walking on the high country for as long as the high country has been the high country. The families of the high country have, in their generations, made their slow, careful agreements with the slow old things. The agreements are kept at small hearths, in small farmhouses, in long, quiet glens. The keeping is the work of the families. The keeping is not the work of the strangers who come up the glens for a winter. May the small farmhouses, friend, in the long generations to come, continue to keep their old agreements. May the slow old things, in their own slow, patient way, continue to keep theirs. And may the strangers who come up the long, quiet glens in their own seasons of need, in the long generations to come, continue to be given by the old families they find at the old hearths, the slow, careful gift of being allowed to witness, in their own quiet way, the keeping of the old agreements. Sleep now, friend. The fire is low and the night is long. The walking, where it is walking tonight, is on roofs that are not this one. The agreements where they are being kept tonight are being kept by old grandmothers who are not us. We are safe by this fire. We have done our small part by listening. Sleep well.